So we know what the topic is. I have a brief introduction talking about why it is that we find writing difficult. Frankly, I've always been totally bewildered by doctoral students who think that they should study statistics and things like that as a priority, whereas in my experience, the statistics is not a priority. You can always figure out some statistics, but the writing is a really important skill, and doctoral programs never teach people the important things, right? But anyway, and then I want to talk about introductions and conclusions. This is on my theme of always talk about the important things at the beginnings and the ends of things, and introductions come at the beginnings of articles and conclusions come at the ends of articles. And then I'll spend a long time talking about the detailed copy editing of what you write. And finally I'll end up talking about how to make what you write a more interesting thing for readers, to make it a more interesting reading. It's amazing how difficult people find writing. There's a man named Chris Argyris who's published a large number of books. He's quite well known. He's a professor at Harvard Business School and Harvard Arts and Sciences. And he has a rule that he will write 500 words every day, 7 days a week, even if it's utter dribble, and if he throws it away tomorrow. And it's just a self-discipline that he imposes on himself to make himself do this writing. I have had a practice for a long time of not getting dressed in the morning until I have done some writing. I don't have a quota that I try to meet, but I stay at home in my pajamas and try to write things, because once I go to the office, there are distractions, there are people to talk to, and all that stuff. So I sit around my house until I can't stand it anymore, and then I go to the office for an escape, right? But lots of people have different solutions for this problem. First reason that people find writing hard is that we know we don't do it very well, right? And we also know that academic writing isn't very good writing. And there we are doing what we think isn't very good stuff. And we're not sure how to deal with that problem. Even if we've gotten, at least I did, I always got very good grades in things I wrote in high school and college and so forth. And yet the truth was, until I was about 40 years of age, I never really took writing seriously enough, and I never saw it as a really central part of my success. So one of the problems we have is that we write with very big words and too long sentences. That's a problem, deficiency. Passive voice, we put a lot of passive voice in what we write. It makes the reading very dull, boring. We use verbose phrasings, and I would think that's especially true of people whose native language is Russian. I'll explain that. Or French, right? There are various languages that are that way. And finally, for many, many people, they have to write in a foreign language, and that's intimidating, of course. And you know you're more insecure when you do that. The more technical reason why writing is hard is that written text is basically one line. It starts at the first word in the first page, right? And it ends at the last word on the last page. And other than that, it's basically a linear trajectory from the beginning to the end. But your brain doesn't work that way. And ideas aren't organized that way. So you have to take things that are fundamentally nonlinear and even parallel and convert them into a line. That's a difficult transformation. Probably, in many ways, is logically impossible. But we have to do it anyway because that's what the constraint of writing imposes on us. You also know that there are so many different ways you could say any one thing that you can spend hours and hours and hours trying to figure out what's the right way to say it. So you can end up making interminable revisions, trying to make it better and better and better. And indeed, I mean, you could spend months revising a manuscript and always find, even at the end of all that time, you find new ways to say it better or ways to make it a little clearer or whatever. The other problem you have is that what you write isn't what other people read. They're coming from a different perspective. They don't have the assumptions that you have implicit. And so when they read it, they don't read what you intended to say. To be successful in this business, you have to somehow find a way to step outside of yourself and to look at what you've written as if you were not yourself. That's a really difficult perceptual step for all of us. You have to get an objectivity about it. Now, of course, you can help this by waiting. You write something and wait several weeks, and then when you come back to it, it'll look different. It'll look newer for you. And then finally, at least in our occupation, we're not writing letters to our friends. We are writing for editors and reviewers, and we feel like they are judging us. We feel like they're acting, at least, as if they know more than we do. And so we get defensive, and we get cautious about, are we saying it in a way that they will understand and appreciate? And we probably overreact, usually. It's been my experience that more junior faculty have failed in their careers because of introductions and conclusions than for all other reasons put together. An example. I had a colleague named Dennis, who was a bright young economist. He finished his PhD when he was 18 years of age. And he was very good looking, too. And he would sit down and he would write an article and send it to the journal Political Economy. 3 months later, he would get back a rejection. And I, as sort of a senior professor, would try to go and sit down with him and talk about, what are you going to do about this rejection? He'd be upset, right? So I go and try to talk with him and calm him down. And what can you do about this thing? Well, what did the reviewers say? Well, they said, we don't understand why you took on this topic. He says, it's obvious. It's a very important topic. And they say, they don't understand why you used the method you did. He said, well, I used the very best method. And they say, well, the reviewers say they don't understand what they should learn as lessons from this thing. He said, well, that's clear to anybody who is a decent economist. They know this stuff. And I would say, but Dennis, your articles don't have introductions or conclusions. You're assuming at the beginning that they know why this is an important topic to write about, so you don't tell them. At the end, you're assuming that they know what the implications are, so you don't let spell those out. And he would look at me like I was an old fuddy-duddy, and he would take his manuscript off and send it off to another journal, and 3 months later he got the same rejection letters back. And this happened over and over again for 5 or 6 years. And finally he quit academia, he went to the U.S. government, and now he's in charge of the U.S. economy. He's one of the senior permanent economists in the U.S. government. Now, there are basic psychological reasons why introductions and conclusions are the most important part of every article. If you give people new material to learn, psychologists like to give people a list of nonsense syllables. These are made-up words that aren't really words in any language. They're just combinations of letters that could be pronounced, but they have no actual meaning in any language. And psychologists spend a lot of time trying to invent these things. And so then you get people and you give them these lists and say, learn this list. And what they discover is that the first words they learn are the end of the list. And the second things they learn are the beginning of the list. And the last thing they learn is the middle of the list. So you learn from the bottom, and then the top, and the middle is the last. And that's true of your articles as well. What readers are most likely to remember is what's at the very end of the article. The second most likely thing they'll remember is what's at the beginning of the article.
Well, here's the problem that you don't know when they will stop reading. I mean, kind of know that it will start from the beginning. You don't know what will be the last thing that they read in your article.
Some readers, and I think a lot of them, will read the introduction and then jump to the conclusion. And they won't actually read the middle until they've got a kind of a grasp.
Well, I mean, this is also a best case scenario that they read the introduction and they won't actually go to it.
Absolutely. Right. If you don't have a very good introduction, you're never going to get anybody into the middle, right? It's just not going to happen.
I don't know if this is relevant, but when I read finance papers, it's all the information is in the intro. Conclusions, as a rule, if I look at the best finance journals, they almost convey no information whatsoever.
In economics, it's as well. Nobody. I think now basically everyone works on the presumption that nobody will actually get to the conclusion, so they put everything in the
I'm going to argue that you need to put really good conclusions on things, okay?
Right.
But together, the introduction and the conclusion should in fact be a synopsis of the essence of the article, right? They shouldn't have to read the middle, because they may not read the middle, right? They may only read the introduction, and if you don't get their attention, at least with the introduction, you're never going to get beyond it. And they may read the conclusion to see what's the point of all this, but they may have never bothered to read the middle part of the article. So the introduction has to entice readers and persuade them to read the article. It's a bait, right? It's an entrapment. And they have to convince readers that this article is worth reading. That may mean that they have to convince them that you are personally a credible source of information, or that you have data that are especially credible, or something like that, right? And then the end of the article, I would say, has to summarize the essence of what's important. I would say all conclusions should start with a long abstract, like a 2-page abstract of what, not like the 150 words that you might have in a real abstract, but an abstract that if they only read that, they would know what this article's about. And then finally, and this is really important, the very last part of the article should explain to them why they're happy they spent the time to read the article, right? They've just spent anywhere from 2 hours to 2 days reading your article, and they're wondering, why the hell did I do this? And you should be able to give them a reason for that. What should they take away from this? Now, how you can get people interested in the beginning? Well, you don't start out and say, well, the literature in this area has been saying this and that and the other thing, and who knows. There are all kinds of different viewpoints. It's just too boring. It's too obvious, right? You have to find something to hook it on. Some current event could be something to hook it on. I said yesterday that one of the things you can do with this is try to create a conflict, and then talk about how are you going to resolve the conflict. Everybody believes this, but the facts are that, right? So what everybody believes is in conflict with what the reality is. And then I'm going to show you why that's the case. Or two different people are saying what appear to be very opposite things, and I'm going to show you that in fact those aren't opposite things, those are just two aspects of a common problem. Or another way to think of this is you're going to say, I went into the locked room and there was a dead body in the middle of the floor, and it was a mystery how it could be that this person was killed and the door was locked. You got to do something to create, right in the very first paragraph, even in the very first sentence, a sense that something's going to happen in this paper, something interesting is going to be in this paper. Don't bore people to death with the first sentence. And a lot of authors do that. It's a very common statement, common practice to put the first sentence as one that doesn't say anything. I'll give you examples of sentences that don't say anything. This is my idea of using dialectic as a way to grab attention, right? Two things that appear to be very different are in fact fully compatible with each other, aren't they? The second thing your introduction has to do is try to establish credibility. Now you can say, well, I'm very credible because my name is Paul Samuelson, right? That doesn't work for everyone. There are cases where you can use your own experience or credentials as a basis for an article being worth reading. Patrick has had a kind of a colleague in Florida who had been hired by a large chemical company to go and join activist environmentalist groups and to spy on them and to report back to the chemical company what the activist environmentalist groups were planning to do. Now, he wanted to write an article about what this whole process of the activist experimentalist group. I would have thought that a perfect way for him to establish credibility at the beginning was to say, I was hired as a spy to go in and spy on these groups, right? Yeah, I think that would make it, anybody reading this would say, well, this is likely to be an interesting article at the beginning, right? And he's probably a credible source of information, right? But usually, for most of us, what we have to do is argue that we have especially good data, or that we have a new analytic technique that nobody's ever been able to use before because we didn't have big enough computers or whatever, right? And so therefore, this article is worth reading because we have some sort of special entree into the subject. There's a guy named Brian Utsi who works at Northwestern University. And he's one of these guys who publishes about one really, really good article every year. And his practice always is he has a one-paragraph synopsis of the literature in the middle of his introduction, which totally reframes the subject area. I don't know anybody else who's had such a consistent record of just seeing the world in a different way and putting it down so concisely in like one eye-catching paragraph. But he's done it again and again. So there are different skills you can use here, but you've got to do something at this point. I mean, when somebody reads what Brian Utsi wrote, they don't know that he's a famous guy or whatever necessarily, but they know this is a guy who suddenly has a different picture of the reality of the literature, and he's been able to reframe this field in a really interesting way. And finally, and this bores authors to death, the end of the introduction for maybe one paragraph ought to just simply outline the paper. The next section is going to be a review of the literature. The section after that is going to describe our methodology. And you think, oh, this is terribly boring. But you know what the paper looks like and the reader doesn't. And you have to give them some kind of guidance information early on, or they'll get to page 6 or page 8 and say, why am I reading this now, right? So they have to have a sense of what the overall map of the paper is, even if it's a very conventional map. And then as you get to the end of the paper, I think it's worthwhile spending a couple of pages summarizing, because of those readers who somehow got to page 19 and didn't understand what they were reading. This is your chance to make it clear to them what it was you were trying to accomplish in the paper and what you think you did do, right? A common error, I believe, is people get to the end of the paper and they write about limitations of this study. Now, you can be forgiven for doing that because so many people do it, and so it's almost conventional. But nobody wants to spend hours reading a paper and get to the end of it and find out that it isn't as good as they had hoped, right? Yes, you have to point out the limitations of your study, but I would put this back in when I talked about research methodology or the kind of data I have or something like that. So be forthright about it, but don't make it the last thing they read, the thing that they're going to remember most, right? Instead, emphasize the stuff that they want to make them think it was worthwhile reading, right? And the other thing is don't give them a bunch of cliches, like well, this study didn't answer all the questions that one could ask about this field, right? No study ever does that. And when they read something like that, readers are bound to think, this is an author who doesn't have very much to say. What?
It's just like we had an experience with our student finishing his like presentation with a slide, which when we read it can be applied to any work. Exactly. Universal conclusions.
You can't imagine
more work is needed.
You can't imagine how many academic authors just do this repeatedly. And it's a waste of words. At the worst, even if the article is accepted for publication, you've wasted an opportunity to actually say something. So there are a bunch of ways you can end this paper by making, in order to make them feel better about their investment, right? I thought that one of my, at least most interesting, maybe enigmatic endings, but I thought it was interesting. I wrote an article and I titled it Congealing Oil. Now, I'm not sure, does congealing translate? It's like when you have a fatty liquid and it gets cooler and cooler and little islands of solid matter form up in it. What is that in Russian? Like butter. Butter is warm and it's all melted and then it begins to cool and eventually it begins to turn into solid.
I'm not sure that in Russian there is specific word. No, that's not about fatty. It's like crystallization. It's more about crystallization. It's not about this oil.
Well,
there's no word.
In the 11th century, at the University of Paris, a professor came to a faculty meeting. Congeal. Yeah. What is it?
Сгущаться, свёртываться, it's like solid. It's more like solid.
Solidifying.
Solidifying.
Yeah, solidifying.
Yeah.
But not yet. So it's
Okay. A professor came to the faculty meeting at the University of Paris, and at that time it was a very small faculty, and he said, I wonder if oil would congeal if you leave it outdoors on a cold night. And the other professor said, I think that's an interesting question. Why don't we investigate that question? So they investigated the question for weeks and weeks. And then they all got together and discussed this, and they concluded that the question had no answer, because they had systematically reread everything that Aristotle had written, and he'd never written on this subject. So I told this story at the end of my article. My article was about how it is that your perceptual framework shapes the conclusions you draw. And I pointed out that you're probably, to the readers, the professors at the University of Paris might seem silly, but they were absolutely correct. Given their perceptual framework, that the only knowledge worth knowing was written by Aristotle, this was an unanswerable question. Right? So my little anecdote, while it had the readers laughing at these silly professors, also demonstrated the basic point of my article, right? And I hoped it did it in a way that made it all kind of memorable. Between these two things, as I've already said, actually, they should, in fact, give a reader a really thorough understanding of the article. They should not have to have read the middle of this paper. I mean, they won't know exactly what statistical methods that you use and things like that, but they will, at that point, know enough about the paper to know whether it's worthwhile reading the middle part, right? They ought to understand this whole thing. And I would say that this is one of the first things you do when you finish a manuscript, is give the manuscript to somebody, not the entire manuscript, but only the introduction and conclusion. I learned this by accident. I had a junior colleague who came from Berkeley, and he had done something on his dissertation, and he had a draft paper, and he said to me, would I read it? And just sort of on a whim, I said to him, I don't have time to read the whole paper, just give me the introduction and the conclusion. he went away and didn't come back for 6 months. And when he came back, he'd totally rewritten the paper entirely. And it won all kinds of awards. It was chosen one of the best papers published in 5 years in one of the top journals. Right? And what had happened was, when he realized that he had to look at just these 2 sections, he hadn't ever made it clear exactly what he was trying to accomplish. And by the time he'd done that, he'd rewritten the whole paper quite dramatically. Right? It gives you a different perspective on what you've done when you essentially strip it down to its skeleton, right? Oh my. Look at the front letters have disappeared from mine. Right? This
Very
is
bad job of
copy editing and making it more interesting. Well, I don't know what happened there, but it's an interesting effect. And well, on and on and on. Now, I told you about my website. And there are a bunch of papers on here. The thing to note about this, if you go to my web page, you won't find this. You have to know this ending. With a capital W. You have to know the ending because I don't want these papers, I don't have copyright permission to distribute them, right? So I don't want them like advertised to the whole world that I'm reprinting somebody else's stuff, but there's no problem with your getting into it. There's a longish document in here, which is actually the basis for this talk that I'm giving this morning, which I call this Fussy Professor Starbuck. And you can, in fact, Google Fussy Professor Starbuck and find this on like a website in New Zealand where I did a talk like this one time, and they put this paper up. I have not revised this document for several years. And then these are other papers that I think are quite interesting. This guy Flesch wrote a book about how to estimate the difficulty of text to read for readers. And I just pulled out 2 or 3 pages out of his book. And this is an article by a couple of scientists on biological scientists, about how to write in a way that scientists find better to understand. And they're talking about things like articles that have complex chemical terms in them or biological jargon or whatever, and how to deal with that. And this is an article by a psychologist that is a long and detailed article that is virtually a program for how to write an empirical article. So it's actually a good map for someone to follow. And earlier, I already mentioned 2 other things in the earlier talks. One is That's Interesting, and the other is Science Marketing, right? They're on that same page. So I would say that because writing is so difficult, the first thing to do is simply get everything down on something, right? It doesn't have to be in a logical sequence even, but you have to get it down in the computer as some sort of a document, and then you can start to play with it and move it around and give it a more logical structure. Before we had computers, I used to sit for weeks at a time, sometimes 3 weeks, and rewrite the first sentence of my article. I would have a yellow sheet of paper with lines on it, and I would write the first sentence, and then I would erase it, and then I would write it over again. And I would do this for 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, or whatever, right? Because when I wrote that sentence, I could see the second sentence coming, and then the third sentence, and then the whole first page, and then the whole article. And so in some sense, that first sentence was the trigger for the whole thing. And I could just see all this coming down logically, and it was driving me nuts. If I didn't get the first sentence right, the whole article would be wrong. That's no longer our problem, right? Word processors. I think I said yesterday, when I first got a word processor, I wrote 3 articles in 1 month, right? And that was the freedom that I suddenly got, was that I no longer had to sit and get that first sentence perfect, right? And that's a freedom that is wonderful to have. So you just worry about what are the basic things you want to say, and then later you worry about how to say it. It's a sequential problem. I think for most people, most of the time, a slideshow is a really good way to begin. This afternoon, I'm going to do a talk. The talk, I'm going to use a slideshow there that is abbreviated from a longer one that I had that would take about 2.5 hours to do. But some French colleagues persuaded me that this might be a good idea for a book, and that I really should do this book, even though I think books are dead. Right? So I'm now taking that long slideshow and expanding it, right? And I'm making it bigger and bigger and bigger. So every time I have one slide, I'm going to try to get 3 or 4 slides and build up the logic of it. I think the advantage of doing this with a slideshow is you maintain the logical structure in a very definite way, so that the flow from the beginning to the end is really never disrupted. And so that's a good way to do it. And the advantage of this, too, is that you can then take your slideshow out and show it to an audience and see what kinds of questions they have. Where do I need a different slide, or where does my slide need revisions, and so forth. So you can sort of take the article apart and see it in pieces. And then you start revising. And again, a very common error I have with young colleagues is they don't spend enough time revising their articles before they send them out the first time. They're so pleased that they got something done, and they're so eager to get their article accepted and to see it in print that they rush out too soon. You have to, I think, take a whole lot of care at that point to say things as well as you possibly can. Because if you don't say them well, it may not get rejected because of what it really says, but of what it appears to say. Words, grammar, and style checker is a help for everybody. Now, you've got to understand it's just a dumb computer program, so it doesn't really know what it is you're trying to say. It's just applying some rules, and quite often it misunderstands. But if it misunderstands, it probably means there's something in the structure of your writing that makes the writing hard to sort out, right? So you probably want to make revisions if it misunderstands. And then there are 2 kinds of problems, 2 things that I think are bad things to have in your writing that Word doesn't really complain about. One is, I'm going to tell you not to use the verb to be. And the second is, I'm going to tell you not to use first or second person pronouns. Now, Word will tell you not to use I, I, right? But it won't tell you not to say we or our or things like that. So if you want to check for first and second person pronouns in the plurals, you have to do that with a find command, right? And then I always run it before I'm finally all done. You know, when I think the manuscript is all done and I'm ready to send it off, I always send it again. Send it through the grammar and style checker again. I've already told you yesterday about how you can use Word's grammar and style checker, the spelling checker basically, to verify that you have all the references in the reference list that you should have, and to verify that everything in the reference list is cited somewhere in the text. Easy check, and you have a program to do that for you.
Okay, I thought you were going to talk a little bit more. Why avoiding the verb to be, and why avoiding...
I will.
Okay.
That's Ames' law.
Okay.
Okay. So you're working on logical flow. The whole article ought to be logical. And this is that business I talked about at the very beginning about how you're trying to get a straight line from the first word to the last word in the paper. And you have to establish that linguistically. So within a paragraph, the second sentence should somehow begin with what is at the end of the first sentence. And the third sentence should somehow begin with what's at the end of the second sentence. So the reader has an easy thread through the text. Likewise, in paragraphs, the paragraph should be linked by the first sentence in the paragraph should somehow go back to the last idea in the preceding paragraph. And the last sentence in the paragraph should somehow feed into the following paragraph, right? And likewise, in the overall structure of the thing, a section should end by giving some lead into the next section. And that each section should begin by sort of hearkening back to the previous section. So again, you're reestablishing this linear pattern through the whole paper. At the same time, you should be trying to remind readers about the structure. I said at the end of the introduction, you should explain what the structure of the paper is. But you have to keep reminding them of this structure as they go through the paper. You have to say at the end of the third section, now the next section is going to discuss this, and then the section after that, you know, you have to keep reminding them of what's coming next.
I've had battles with senior co-authors over this, because I'm a proponent of keep repeating, because at least myself, I forget I just read the section, I've already forgotten what I just read. And so I want to keep repeating.
Yes, that's right.
But I've also gotten
I would say all your
referees
main ideas, the main ideas in the paper should somehow be said 3 times. Probably in the introduction, in a very sketchy way, you should say, this is what we're going to talk about. And then in the middle part of the paper, you probably lay it out in some gruesome detail. And then at the end, you have this summary at the end of the paper.
I guess maybe what I'm really asking is, how much is too much?
I don't know. I don't know. Avoid synonyms. When I was first writing, I used to intentionally use different words for the same concept so it wouldn't be boring. I would have variety. There's 3 different words for the same idea, right? And kind of mix them up. And at some point I realized what's interesting to me is just confusing to readers. They want to know how it is that this word and that word are different. And you think they're equivalent, you're treating them as equivalent, but in fact, right, like teams and groups, right? And maybe you think that sometimes it's interesting teams and sometimes it's interesting to say groups, but the readers are sitting there and saying, now how are teams different from groups? Is there something about, in the theory here, that they're trying to make a distinction? And then you have to be, in sociology especially, at least that's what I think of it, there was a practice of trying to state every theory at 3 levels. They would try to have what they called an operational level, which was really the level at which you actually measured the concepts. What were the things in your questionnaires or your interviews or whatever. And then there would be an intermediate level, which would be somehow more aggregated and abstract than this operational level, and a generalization of it. And then there would be some grand theoretical level that was supposed to be a generalization of the intermediate level. The problem with that is that I've seen innumerable logical errors happen as a result of that, because people overgeneralize what they're doing. So my personal preference is to keep everything just as specific as possible. If you're talking about a Pearson correlation coefficient, don't use the word relationship to denote that, because relationship is a very much more general word than correlation coefficient. So I would always say correlation coefficient. Well, I just said this to Patrick. At least say your main points. You try to get them down there 3 times. So there's no way somebody can get through this thing. At least not, you haven't made an effort to tell them what you're about. Yes, you should never state anything more simply than it's possible to state it. I worked really hard to get readability down to a low level. My natural writing level is about grade 18 or grade 20. College graduate is grade 16. All right? So grade 18 would be somebody with a master's degree. Right? Grade 20 would be somebody with a PhD, probably. Right? And that's my natural level of writing. But then Word will tell you the grade level if you ask it to do that. And I always try to get it down to as low as possible. My target is to get it down to the level of somebody who's just beginning college. I can't always accomplish that. But my premise is that if you can get the grade level down, even very highly educated people are less likely to misunderstand what you're saying. You want to have short sentences and little words and very clear statements. It's true that it doesn't sound very fancy, but it also avoids misunderstandings. The central issues in readability are how big are the words in terms of numbers of syllables in their word, and how long are the sentences. If a sentence is longer than 30 words, you're in big trouble. You don't want a lot of little short sentences like 15 words, but you want sentences that don't go on. I edited a big book, and one of the authors that we had in the book was a very famous sociologist who'd been born in Austria. And at one point, going through his manuscript, he had one sentence that began at the top of a page and filled the entire page. But it had no verb. If you know German, you understand how this happened, right? The verb always comes at the end. And by the time he'd written 250 words in this sentence, he'd forgotten all about putting a verb on there, right? Now, that I would say is not easy reading to understand. Right? Now, a game I have played sometimes, but this is only to find all the big words, is that you can replace all the spaces between words with tabs. And you can get rid of all the dates and periods and commas and all that kind of stuff. And then put the whole thing into Excel. And you have a long column of just all the words in the article. 60,000 words or whatever it is, and then you can create a formula to count the number of letters in each word and pull all the really big words up to the top of the list. And then you can look at those big words and see, what am I doing? For example, the word organization can be replaced by firm. Right? Firm is a one syllable, easy little word. Organization is 4 syllables, and it's a more complicated word. Now, of course, if you're not writing about firms, then saying firms isn't going to be very useful, but at least being able to identify these words that are the big, long, clunky ones is helpful. And now we come to Russian. I don't know anything about Russian, so this is not me. I'm going to blame everybody else. I consulted Lydia and my wife, Joan. Both of Lydia, as you may know, is a reporter who works for Reuters, and my wife does copy editing for people whose native language isn't English. Well, for people whose native language is English too. And my wife has worked for a couple of Russians, and Lydia runs into Russians all the time. She lives here in Moscow and does this, and so they have this perspective of what's required to turn Russian writing in English by Russian people into more readable English. I already talked about my Viennese guy, right? He, in a sense, he was a prisoner of having grown up speaking German. And he thought that the way in which Germans write is a good way to write. And maybe it is in German, it's just not a good way to write in English, right? English has its own peculiarities. I had this colleague, born in Czechoslovakia, who immigrated to Sweden, and he spoke about 6 languages. And one day he said to me, you know, I just love speaking English, because no matter what you say, it means something. Well, that's both a strength and a weakness of English, isn't it? Right? Some languages impose a much more rigorous structure on what's a legitimate thing to say. English will let you put words together in almost any combination, but it may not mean what you intended to say, right? But English likes short sentences, it likes very simple ideas, apparently, as I understand it, there's a tendency in Russian not to go directly to the point, but rather to kind of talk around the topic at the beginning, right? And then to kind of home in on it gradually, and maybe about the middle of the article you get around to telling them what it's about, right? No?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's not a good idea when you go into English, right? You've got to get right to the point right at the beginning. And there's another apparent pattern in Russian writing, which is you kind of mix up ideas. In this section, you'll find some ideas carried over from the last section, and some ideas that are going to pop up in the next section, and they're sort of muddled together. And you really have to kind of get each section of the article focused on a single topic. Similarly, the same pattern happens with paragraphs. There's a tendency in Russian writing to mix different ideas in one paragraph, and in English you just don't do that. You try to keep each paragraph on a single topic. Apparently, Russian sentences are much longer, are they, than English sentences? Right? So you have to find a way to break these things down into 25-word pieces. And I might know, by the way, many of these patterns are the same in French. Right? So Russian isn't the only language that does this, but strings of adjectives. At least both of these women I used as experts say that there's a tendency in Russian to string together 3 or 4 adjectives in a row. My own rule is never more than 2 adjectives with an N. Right? Now I have a couple of pet hobby horses. One is the use of the definite article to create plurals. Some languages, and I don't know about Russian, but the French language, you put the everywhere. Almost every time you use a noun, you put the with it. And this tends to lead to a lot of usage of the. The problem with the is that there's a practice of using the instead of a plural. Instead of saying lions, you say the lion. And this is a usage that sort of implies generalization. The lion has 4 legs. Does it mean that every lion has 4 legs? Absolutely not. No, it isn't true. Every lion has 4 legs. But when you say the lion has 4 legs, you mean somehow the prototypic generic lion has 4 legs, right? So you're really talking about a plural. You're making a generalization at that point. I personally think you ought always to say lions have 4 legs to remind yourself that you're generalizing, and that this is not a definite thing about everyone.
But it seems that I'm not sure if it's okay for everyone, but I've never seen this being a problem for Russians.
Because Russians don't get the article. Like,
You don't have articles?
We don't have articles, and that's the thing that Russians don't get completely.
Oh,
How to
okay.
use articles.
Okay, I didn't know this.
Exactly
about
because of that.
That's what.
No, I have
We use this.
I have a Korean friend, and in Korean language there are no articles, and so he randomizes stuff.
Well, that's the Russian one.
This is not a good use, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I didn't know. So Russian has no articles.
Yeah, but it's not this usage.
Yes, right, right. Okay, so you won't be prone to this. I'm sorry. Whoa, this is another one of the slides that somehow got out of whack. Well, this is again on the theme of a and the, right? And but I don't need to go that way because that's not what your problem is.
Oh, we do
No,
that.
that's the problem because that was that's very useful because we don't have no idea how to use articles.
Just
Like,
get around
any information is
No.
valuable.
Wait a minute, I got that. This is not backing up.
And then
Here we go. Okay, well, this is, see, the formatting is messed up here.
let's see if we can fix this.
Well, it's probably a mistake on my slides. I must have.
No, it's probably because like different versions of PowerPoint.
It could be.
we have
You
an
told me
older
to save
version.
it, and yeah, right.
The slideshow.
Yeah.
The A is not there.
Yeah, it's just not there.
Просто потянуть надо наверх.
Yeah.
No, it's not
Okay.
there.
Well, I'll figure it out, but not today.
Right.
It's not on the slide.
Anyway, we have definite articles and indefinite articles. In French, un is the indefinite article. In English, it's a or an. One, right? But it's general. Definite article is much more specific, in the, right? For example, a firm versus the firm. A firm is any possible firm, right? But only one of them, but any one. The firm is one specific firm, Scholar-3, right? When you say the firm, like the theory of the firm, that's what I was talking about, is using the to create a plural, right? You don't mean the one specific Shell Oil Company in this theory, right? You mean a prototypical firm. So they're using the definite article to create the picture of a prototypic firm, right?
The theory of the firm is a kind of is an expression that is used generically, basically, to denote.
It is very common in economics, but I pull it out because it is so common in economics.
So it's kind of tricky.
Yeah, and if you said a theory of a firm,
or just
right,
the theory
that
of the
would
firm,
be, right?
also, that would be.
That would actually be correct, because this is one offered theory, except it isn't true. In microeconomics, they only have one theory of the firm.
Yeah, that's why the theory of
Yeah.
firm,
Yeah.
without
Firms.
that,
Yeah.
of firms, yes,
Yeah,
of firms.
if you wanted it to mean the same without the article.
Yet,
A theory of firms would be
the theory
the
of
proper
Yet you
generalization,
cannot
right?
write like that because there's a term for that. There's a term with a D in front of firms, and everybody calls this.
Well, it's true in that specific case, you're right, but more generally in writing, it's not a good idea, I think, to do that, because you fall into overgeneralizing what you've actually observed, right? You have data about one company, and you accidentally portray it as if it's lots of companies.
Yes.
This is
There's a-
just saying
there's-
the theory is a little bit ambitious.
It is. As if there's only one theory. But in fact, microeconomists are in such consensus that
They are a little bit over ambitious.
Yes.
Yet in language there's a whole spectrum of such, almost I would say, idiomatic expressions that are used more often or less often. It's not a rule. Like there's a list of expressions that everybody uses, and the rest you should not put the Z in front. But there's somehow kind of the whole spectrum of those. Some of them are used consistently and some are less consistently. It's
What are you
really-
going to do with it?
Yes, exactly. It's difficult to where to put the line. Which ones you should use?
All I want to do is sensitize you to this issue, so that you don't go around overgeneralizing what you've done. That's my goal, right? I just think that it's not good science to say things that are more general than your actual data will support. Now, this is sort of a breakthrough thought for me at some point in the past. When I was a doctoral student, almost everybody used the writing manual for the American Psychological Association, and it legally barred the use of I, you, any first or second person pronoun, we, whatever, right? Couldn't do it. And then they began loosening this up, and you began having these things pop in, and everybody started saying, I did this, and I did that, and the other thing. And at some point, it suddenly occurred to me that when I'm saying I did this and I did that, I'm making it harder for my readers to buy my ideas. If I say, my theory is this, then it can't be their theory. And that's not my goal in life, is for them to think it's my theory. A colleague and I wrote an article. They got into one of the most prestigious journals in the social sciences. And they sent our article for editing to a little old lady who was really grumpy. They were famous for doing this. They always sent all the articles off this. She was a botanist. And the idea was that anything in the journal, even a botanist ought to be able to understand, right? So they sent it off to her, and she'd write back and scribble all over everything. Botanists, they study plants. So your manuscript would come back, and there'd be pencil scribbles all over the thing. But at the end of it, this woman wrote, this article seems to be so obvious that I don't understand why nobody's ever said this before. She was trying to insult us. We thought that's exactly the goal we were trying to achieve. That it was so obvious, right? We had written it in such a logical, clear way that it was a mystery why nobody had ever said this before. But you're trying to give your ideas away. You're trying to write in such a way that the readers think, oh, I've been thinking this all along, or this seems like so obvious. You know, I like that idea. You want to give everything you have away. Now, some things you can't give away. If you went and interviewed somebody, you have to say, I interviewed somebody, right? So if it's actually something you personally did, you have to own it, probably in the methodology section. But in terms of whose theory it is, I would never label anything I did as my theory or my methodology or whatever. Right? I would avoid labeling it that way.
But with, sorry,
No, you go ahead.
but with doing, like when you describe what you did, there's like kind of choice. You can do it either in passive voice or use this pronoun. So which one?
I'm going to show you.
Worst?
I'm going to talk about that. Yeah.
So it's a kind of, so instead of saying our methodology is the methodology of this paper is?
Yes, right. Yeah. This paper uses a methodology such as the following or something. And in fact, that's probably not bad, because by the time the paper's published and somebody reads it, you may have moved on to a different methodology, but the paper's still stuck there doing the same old thing. Now, but on the passive verb thing, that Herbert Simon used to have talks with us and explain to us that because we couldn't use first and second person pronouns, we must use passive verbs. I would dispute that with Herbert. I think there's a way to avoid this, but I'll explain what that is, right? Now the word we and our and things like that is another different kind of problem. In one manuscript you can find we used three very different ways. We as the authors, a co-authored article, the two of us, we. Or we as economists, as a subfield, a subpopulation of the world, or we as humanity. And you can easily find papers that use all three versions of we in a single paper, which creates all kinds of ambiguity. Do the authors think they're equivalent to humanity, right? So if you're going to use we, use it only one of those three ways. Don't use it all three ways. Now I'm shifting off to how to make your writing more interesting. I've already mentioned to you this article, That's Interesting, and it's in this section with the capital W. Up to here you find this very public. It's easy to get to. But at that point you have to type the slash mark in the word writing, as you won't see it on the menu. And as I already said back at the beginning, or actually yesterday, I think a good way to begin any article is by creating some kind of a conflict, some kind of a mystery or something, and then talk about how to resolve these conflicts. So, what this guy Davis did, I'm reminding, some of you may not have been here, what he did was he analyzed the most memorable articles and books in sociology to see what kind of patterns did they have, and he concluded that the really famous books had this pattern of creating some sort of a contradiction and then trying to resolve it in some way. But it's basically the struggle between two ideas or two viewpoints or something that you're working with. Avoid cliches. Now, all my examples there, you'll find, I'm only going to give you a few examples. That article, or the document I called Fussy Professor Starbuck, will give you dozens and dozens of examples for each of these things. But these are a few examples of cliches and obvious statements. And remember I said don't begin the article with one of these things. So these are the kinds of statements people often begin articles with. Can you imagine somebody who would actually say, as an opening statement in a paragraph, this is often what would happen. You find sitting someplace, like in the methodology section, somebody will write that sentence to begin a paragraph. There are fundamental limitations to such approaches. What approach to research does not have a fundamental limitation? It's impossible, right? Or imagine somebody writing an article related to politics who says public administration doesn't operate in a political vacuum. Well, yeah. But my feeling is when you're reading along and you read a sentence like that, you think this is an author who doesn't have anything to say. They're not thinking, right? They're wasting their words and my time.
But then I wouldn't fall into the circle that you brought two examples. One for Dennis, it's obvious what's right. And second,
you have to have better judgment than Dennis about what it is.
Certainly, but I'm coming up as a kind of too extreme argument. And second one about those two guys in Paris. Let's say the fact about the world.
Yes. They're locked in their own perspective.
Yes, but at the end they're locked in perspective. But at some point they start that this is interesting. So how exactly they communicate why this is interesting, why they thought it is interesting, so that did they think that Aristotle would have written this, or that was just interesting with themselves? How exactly?
It just never occurred to them that if there was anything worth knowing that Aristotle had written about. That was the concept of what academic knowledge was in those days, 500 years ago.
No, it's longer different. They admit that something can be interesting because they ask this question.
Yes.
But they said like the methodology is only referring to Aristotle, so you can't answer this question.
But he wrote on everything that was worth knowing.
But say, why I bring that? Because sometimes, say, I do, part of the research I'm doing, so there is a general perception coming from the works of the authors that if you own private information, you should reveal it, for instance. And that is actually the perception. Some people know. I mean, many people know that that is not exactly true. But then that is part of the kind of argument that you want to make.
Yes.
So in some sense,
Right.
you are making an argument
Right.
about it.
Right.
I am
Right.
making an argument
Right.
about the fundamental...
Yeah, but that's what I mean by pointing to contradictions and conflicts. Everybody believes this, but it's not true. And I will show you in this article the evidence that it can't be true.
So it's okay if you start like the first sentence is like this, but the second sentence is that this is not
But
true.
exactly. You have to create this conflict, and I would do it like in the first and second sentences of the article. Certainly in the first paragraph, you have to set it up so that by the time they've read that first paragraph, they know something interesting is going to happen in the article.
So would it be fair to say then, if you're saying that there are fundamental limitations to existing methodologies that and we're improving on that in our paper?
No, you're going to say, and we're going to show there are no fundamental limitations on our methodology. No, I would avoid saying there are fundamental limitations to all methodologies. I mean, that's obvious, right?
Okay.
So, no, you might say something like, people believe that you can't use this technique for that reason, and we're going to show that in fact there's a way
about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
One other thing, and this is a rule I use, the bottom sentence there. If I find myself putting obviously or clearly at the beginning of a sentence, I delete the whole sentence. If it's obvious, it's not I shouldn't be saying it, right? And if it's not obvious, then I shouldn't say it's obvious. Now, it's useful to use some catchy phrases and some catchy titles. Don't overdo it. Don't use two catchy phrases in one article, and probably don't use a catchy phrase in every article, right? Don't fall into the trap of trying to make everything a gimmick. But gimmicks can be very useful. James March wrote about something called the garbage can model of organizational decision making. That caught a lot of attention. I don't think the article actually said that much, but boy is it cited a lot. And I think it's cited largely because of that title, right? An intriguing title. Herbert Simon formulated this word satisficing to create a contrast with maximizing. And that idea really caught on. This is another James March. He's been a specialist in some of this stuff. He wrote an article that became quite well known, The Technology of Foolishness. Who ever thought of technology as a way to implement foolishness? Well, in fact, there's not really a technology of foolishness. He just meant there are various methods and procedures you can use to generate innovative, deviant ideas. This is one, a guy named Quant and Will Baumol wrote an article they called, it was in the American Economic Review, A Theory of Optimally Imperfect Decision Making. I thought this is a really great idea. Go read the article. They basically concluded that the theory is too complicated and we can't figure out do optimally imperfect decision making, right? But boy, is the article successful, right? And the other thing is, if you're going to illustrate the ideas, try to find one that's sort of obvious and natural to do. When Simon introduced satisficing, like why would people satisfice, he used the idea of I'm going to sell a house, and how do I know when to accept the last offer I got? Or when should I hold out for the next offer? And so it was a sequential decision-making analogy that he had. And he actually talked about it as if it could be an optimization problem, but that was, of course, not what he was about. Meyer and Rowan wrote about how it is that organizations do things that are in fact facades that conceal what's really going on. They created a misimpression about things. And they used school administration as an example, and they pointed out that the way in which schools operate is pretty much the same today as it was 4,000 years ago. You have a teacher and some students, and they sit in a room and they talk. And yet, the way in which schools appear to operate is quite different than it was 4,000 years ago, because now you have accounting departments and superintendents and district supervisors and all this stuff. And they argued that the reason this is this way today is that in today's society, where we expect big organizations to be rationally organized, you want to create the appearance that the school system has a rational organization. Whereas, in fact, it still isn't doing anything different than it ever did, right? So this is sort of a sales gimmick that the schools have. There's a rather well-known article about workers in factories, and the workers would take breaks every once in a while, and the article talked about the different kinds of breaks they had, and the ways in which they shifted work among different teams. And it had various labels that the workers had used, and one of them was banana time. But the author, a guy named Roy, picked this up, and in his title, he called it Banana Time. That was the title of the article, and that became like a catchphrase that everybody can remember. Who ever heard of Banana Time, right? But once you hear it, you think, well, that's an interesting idea. On the other hand, I had this friend, Danny Miller, and he wrote a book about how it is that when companies get a good idea, they often take it to ludicrous extremes, and they carry it so far that it doesn't make any sense. His publisher, his book publisher, said he should call it the Icarus Paradox. Nobody knows what the hell that is. It probably killed the book, right? Why? What is the Icarus Paradox? Why would you read a book called the Icarus Paradox?
Though, so in some sense, practitioners, if you think the publisher is doing their job quite well and they know their readers, maybe they don't have that suggestion.
In that particular case, these publishers really didn't have any idea what they were doing. Right? I would have called his book Too Much of a Good Thing, because that's really what it was, right? It's a good idea, but you go too far with it and it loses its value.
But they have
Suffer from the
winner's curse. Such a catchy phrase. On the other hand, like the winner's curse, perfect type. It's the same thing. So.
This is a real ad. What are they trying to do?
To be honest,
Microsoft software is just like the Titanic. Okay. I try to use the present tense as much as possible. My one exception would be when I'm quoting somebody. If I'm quoting somebody, I would say they said in the past tense, because if a few months from now, they might not be saying that anymore, right? But insofar as I can say things in the present tense, I try to do it that way. Not the past tense and not the future tense. I don't say this article will discuss such and such topic. I say this article does discuss that topic. I don't say theories used to be. I would say theories are, if it's still true that they are, right? You're trying to boil this thing down to something really essential. Now, when I first got tenure, I was an economist. And I wrote an article, and the chair of my department was a man named Ed Ames. And he read my manuscript, And he said, I want to talk with you. So he takes me into the conference room beside his office, and he writes on the board just what I've written here. Verb is preferred to adverb, is preferred to adjective, is preferred to noun. And that's Ames' law. And he explained to me that I was writing with too many nouns and too many adjectives and not enough verbs and not enough adverbs. I was stating my ideas in terms of nouns instead of verbs. And why was that important? He said, because your writing is really boring. It's hard to read. It's hard to maintain your interest in your manuscript because it's so boring. So he said, you should try to convert the ideas that you're stating as nouns into ideas you state as verbs. Because verbs have action involved with them. Well, I believed this, and I actually tried to do that for a number of years. And then I was working in Berlin, and I read a book about the verb to be. And this book said you should avoid using the verb to be because it makes writing boring. Because it describes equilibrium states. Things are this equals that. Nothing is changing. They're in equilibrium. They're in balance. They're equivalent. Right? You want to use active verbs, they said. I suddenly realized what was wrong with Ed Ames' rule. He only talked about one kind of verb. But there are two kinds of verbs. There are active verbs and passive verbs. And passive verbs are a bad idea. They're much like the to-be verbs. Active verbs create this sense of life and action. Passive verbs make things boring, verbose, right? They create a world in which everything is static and in equilibrium. Now, when I read this, I started to change my writing. Because I tried to find ways not only to convert nouns into verbs, but also to use more active verbs and to avoid passive verbs. And one of the things that happened, and I'll come back to it, is I began to think differently as a result of that. One of the first things that happens with passive verbs is they allow you to hide causation. You can say things happen, and you don't say what made them happen. If you start to use active verbs, you have to say who did it, right? Or what did it. So you have to be explicit about causal processes.
So when you're objecting to the use of to be, you're really more objecting to passive than, you wouldn't have a problem then with a sentence that is the answer, the ultimate answer is.
I would have a problem with that. Because that's, again, a passive, a flat equilibrium state. The answer is, and it can't ever change, right? The answer is in that state and will never get better or worse. And it didn't develop, right? Or you could say, however, the answer turns out to be, and now you've described like a mystery story that you've solved. You see that? It makes it more interesting. It doesn't really say anything different, but it makes more interesting reading. The reader feels like something's happening. Now, I'm going to go through some examples. The fundamental rule for getting out of a passive voice and into an active voice is figure out what is the causal agent and then create a sentence in which the causal agent is the subject of the sentence. And I've got several examples here. This is a passive. Data are then presented. The next section presents the data. At least you let the sentence do the action. It's a very small, even trivial level of language editing, but it makes the sentence. And notice also that it tends, in general, to make it shorter. My general experience is that when you get rid of all the passive verbs, and Word would mostly, in a grammar's checker, will mostly identify passive verbs, you'll cut the length of the article by about 25%. decision makers were responsible for. This is actually a to-be verb with an adjective, right? And you change it to an active verb. Decision makers can. The purpose of this article is to develop. This is a to-be verb with an infinitive, which is a noun, right? So this is a to-be verb plus a noun. This article develops, active verb. This is actually a future tense with a to-be verb, but it's a passive form. It is shown, right? Something is going to show this, right? The next section shows it. Now, this is all examples that are passive voice specifically. And you can kind of see already, though, that you mostly are getting rid of words when you do this. This group of 4 words is less than this group of 6 words, right? So that's how you get this reduction of about 25% in length, because you just throw away some words in the process of making these conversions. You can just read these, huh? You don't need to have me read them to you. To be plus an adjective or to be plus a noun are almost the same as a passive verb. A lot of times a passive verb is a past participle, and the past participle is in fact an adjective as well. So to be plus an adjective can be almost identical with a passive verb. And these are 2 examples. I've already given you a couple, but they are illustrative of. I mean, this is a very verbose phrasing in which you have a to-be verb and an adjective. Often when the word the, of is in there, it's already a sign of verbosity. And if you just say they illustrate it, right? Not that they are illustrative of, they just illustrate it, or they show it, or whatever, right? And then this is the noun, adjective form. Here's the noun form. This is a to-be verb, and the identification of is a noun. And you just say, shift it to the active verb. Often you find that articles begin, or sections begin, with what I call lead-in phrases. Sentences that begin, there is, there are, it is, right? Very often, that beginning part can just be deleted. I don't know why people like these lead-in phrases, but they're often just extraneous words that you don't actually need. I mean, look at the reduction in verbosity between this phrasing and this phrasing. It's very dramatic. Now, as I said, when I started to do this stuff, I did it first because Ed Ames told me I could write in a more interesting way, and that would be helpful in getting my stuff understood and read. And then I read this book about to be, and I decided this is a good idea. Maybe I can make it even better writing. That happened at about a time in my life when I decided I didn't want to do mathematical models anymore, and I wanted to start telling stories and get more readership and stuff. And so learning how to write became kind of a sub-goal in my career path. But my goal was entirely to get better writing. What I discovered was that I went along and my whole thinking pattern shifted. As I began editing my writing in more and more detail, I began analyzing my logic more and more carefully. And I began finding logical gaps and logical errors and things like that that I hadn't seen before. It's the nitpicking detail of the logic. As I began being careful about my usage of definite and indefinite articles, I began realizing that I was sometimes generalizing beyond my data, and I should be more careful about that. As I began getting rid of first and second person pronouns, I realized that I was very often using personal opinions when I could in fact be stating things that most everybody would accept, right? And of course it's better salesmanship in science to not make them your personal opinions. When I got rid of the passive voice, I began paying much more attention to causation. And I began thinking about not only causation, but change. I was unhappy with theories about equilibrium and more happy with theories about dynamics. It's all in how you package the stuff. I told Patrick a story last night that sort of fits. I went to Mexico, and I went on kind of a boondoggle. I was working for the German government, and we could kind of go wherever we wanted to do whatever. Right? So I went to the conference. It turned out to be the conference of the budget directors of different countries. All the major countries in the world went to Mexico City, their budget directors, and they all sat and talked to each other about their national budgets. I didn't fit at all with the whole thing, but I just wanted to go to Mexico. I'd never been to Mexico, and they had set up for these people who went to this conference to have a tour of Mexico with Thomas Cook, the British travel firm. It's no longer part of British government, but at that time it was part of British government. So I signed up for the tour of Mexico. I discovered, when I began the tour, I was the only person on the tour. So I would go for 2 weeks. I went around Mexico, and I would land in an airplane, and a limousine would pull up, and I would get off the airplane and into the limousine. They'd drive me to my hotel, and then next morning they'd pick me up in the limousine, and they'd take me to some pyramids or something and show me some ruins or whatever, and then in the evening they'd bring me back and so forth. And we went around for 2 weeks. And before I'd ever gone to Mexico, I'd read tour books and stuff, and I read that you should not drink the water in Mexico. They thought, well, it's probably okay to drink the water if you're in Mexico City in one of the big hotels. Oh, I mean the water out of the faucet. But otherwise, you should only drink water that's in bottles, bottled water. Because the sewage systems are unreliable and you don't know what's going to happen. So for 2 weeks, I only drank the water in the bottles in my hotel room. Finally, near the end of the tour, I'm in Mérida, Yucatan. It's the middle of August. It's very, very hot, very, very humid. It's 11 o'clock at night, and my bottle of water is empty. So I take my bottle, I go down to the desk clerk at the entrance of the hotel, and I said, could you get me some more water? He says, yes, I'll be happy to get you water. I'm doing something right now, but in just a minute I'll get it for you. But he said, you could get the water for yourself if you want. And I said, well, sure, I'd be happy to get the water myself. How do I do that? He says, go over there to that faucet and fill the bottle. I said, well, wait a minute. You mean the water in our room, in the bottles, is the same water that comes out of the faucets? He says, of course. I said, then why do you put it in the bottle? He said, we found that tourists don't drink it unless we put it in the bottles. You may have very good ideas, right? But if you don't put them in the right bottles, they're not going to drink it. Oh, I did this in Paris, and I would do this with you if you were around. I think it's a good idea for you to form little groups of about 3 people and exchange your introductions and conclusions with each other, and then sit and talk with each other about how you can make them better introductions and conclusions. And I would do this on a routine basis, right? I tried to get them to do this at a school called ESSEC outside Paris. I think the business of talking with other people clarifies some of the ideas I've talked about and how you can make introductions more interesting, conclusions more persuasive. But it also helps to build teamwork, nest building, right? It helps to build this sense that we're all in this enterprise together and we're trying to help each other go someplace. Done.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.